Hello everybody, this is Cynthia Kane. Welcome back to our second video tutorial for our class dealing with scope. Scope is covered in the second chapter of the Information Literacy User's Guide, our textbook, and it is also considered to be the second pillar of information literacy. Essentially, it means knowing what is available. Now, we've talked about this a little bit in our first video tutorial in terms of identify when I was going through the topic of electronic cigarettes and figuring out my perspectives, the sources that I would need, and then how I would actually find those sources. This does again relate to scope because in scope, we want to understand, know, and recognize different types of information and how that format affects that content. And we also want you to be able to identify which types of information will best meet your research need. We'll be focusing on other areas too, such as identifying available search tools, formats, and being able to use new tools. But this is where identify and scope really do relate very closely to each other. So chapter 2 of our textbook with scope talks about a traditional hierarchy of information formats. When I say traditional, this actually really dates back to when I was in college over 30 years ago. I do believe things have changed tremendously with the advent of information technologies, the internet, and in particular social media, which we talked about a little bit during our first video tutorial on identify. So a traditional hierarchy might be that we might have breaking news published in print forms, such as newspapers, magazines, and so forth. Now they might be publicized or published in online news sites such as MSNBC or CNN.com or Google News. At that point, we might have information then being refined further through government documents, scholarly journals, and finally books that would actually contain maybe more theoretical perspectives of what started out up here in news in the first place. You can see that the hierarchy works in terms of in-depth information not being that much in terms of news, but then the analysis of that information gets much more in-depth until you start looking at books or scholarly monographs. Again, I want you to consider this question. Where does social media fit into this hierarchy, or indeed does it? So the information life cycle is covered in chapter 2 of our textbook on pages 17 and 18, in which an idea is created. It's presented perhaps through scholarly conferences or again through the dissemination of news or other media. The idea might be refined by publishing in scholarly journals or critical reviews of the idea. And finally, deeper thinking, again, theoretical perspectives about an idea would finally appear in books. What we're going to do, though, is look at the life cycle of information in another way. So I'm dealing kind of with my research question that we talked about in our first video tutorial. Somebody once told me that duct tape can be used to remove warts from skin. Is that true? Does it actually work? Well, let's take that topic through that same information life cycle, the creation of an idea. I would love to know whoever thought about using duct tape for wart removal. Was that just something that somebody tried as a last-ditch attempt or a desperate way of removing warts? It had to come from somewhere, so that idea had to be created. And then somehow, that idea had to be presented. So I'm thinking that perhaps it was passed along, perhaps word of mouth, as folk remedies, folk medicine, basically remedies that, had been tried throughout the years. And then somehow this idea had to be refined because as we're going to see, there are actually different types of medical journal articles out there that do talk about using duct tape to remove warts. So that idea actually had to be refined. Maybe somebody tried some experiments in a lab with human subjects. Somehow this idea was actually published in scholarly journal articles. Whether it would work or whether it did not work. Maybe there was something about removing oxygen by using duct tape that might help to dry up a wart. Somehow, again, though, that idea was refined. And finally, in the information life cycle, we had that deeper thinking about that idea. So we might now have medical books about wart treatment, but go back to the idea of the presentation of the idea, that it may have been presented as folk medicine, folk remedies. So somehow, probably books have been written about the history of folk medicine, including how the idea of duct tape ever came about in the first place for wart removal. So you can see you can have actually some fun with an idea. It doesn't have to be totally serious, but it can still go through that information life cycle, creating that idea, the presentation of the idea, the refinement of the idea, and finally, deeper thinking about the idea. So back to the topic. If I'm trying to identify how I'm going to start looking for information, what sources can I use? If you're affiliated with a library, such as Emporia State University, you can use a library catalog. And a catalog can consider to be a database that contains all of the ideas located in a library, as well as all of the items to which the library does have access. So I could find books, perhaps I could find access to journal articles. We have what's called a discovery search at the library's webpage, and it is a combination of books, articles, and other references that are owned by our library and also by other libraries. Later in our course, you're going to have an opportunity to use the discovery search to find information on a topic of your choice. Other information resources can be library databases. Now, some of you may be familiar with some of these, even if you don't really call them a database. If you've ever used databases such as Academic Search Complete, CQ Researcher, LexisNexis Academic, anything that might ring a bell in terms of the name of the database, you may already have used that to find articles. You can use Google, and you can also use Google Scholar to find websites. Google Scholar can also help you identify articles that are out there which may be accessible freely online. Social media platforms, though, can also be information resources. Sometimes that can be called crowdsourcing an idea or crowdsourcing what people think about a particular concept, because you might also be able to use social media to cover this last bullet point, personal communications. Who knows about your topic? How do you identify who might be an expert in the field, and would you want to go talk with them? That can also be an information resource, so don't ever rule out people, especially if they are experts in your field. So going back to duct tape can be used to remove warts from one's hand. If I'm going to start searching for information, I want to start identifying keywords such as duct tape, warts, perhaps removal. I can take nouns from the particular topic, but I can also look for verbs, which is why I took the word remove and I turned that to removal, and I can convert that into a noun that I can use to find information as well. I could do truth, I could do myth, work, and then I can take those words and combine them with what we would call Boolean operators. And I'm sure that you've already used these. And or not. And will actually limit your search, because if you use the word and, you want to find information about something and something else. So I might want wart removal and treatment, wart removal and duct tape. Or we'll broaden that search. So I could say wart removal and truth or myth, because then I'll get information about both the truth and also the myth about wart removal and duct tape. Not is a very powerful word. I would only use the word not when you're searching for information if you're absolutely sure that you do not want something in your search for information. So in this example that I've given you, I might want information only having to do with dogs, not cats. And in that particular instance, that is what I'm going to be eliminating from my search. But if I use the word not, I also am going to take a chance that I'm going to eliminate information that could be potentially useful. So most of the time, if I'm searching, I actually use the words and or. So we bring together our keywords. We have duct tape, warts, wart removal, hand, skin, wart treatment, medical, theory, truth. I could throw in a lot of others too. So if I'm searching in Google, if I'm searching in the Discovery search in our library's webpage, if I'm searching in a database such as Academic Search Complete, this is what I can put in with what we would call a search statement. Duct tape and wart removal. Duct tape and, you notice I put these words in parentheses. I want warts or wart removal or wart treatment, and I want those words that are in parentheses to be combined with the words duct tape. Always have a lot of different possibilities on hand that you can search for information, because the first thing that you actually put into a database or into a library catalog may not actually work. So always make sure that you have other keywords that you can put in to really broaden your search more effectively. So now we're going to look at upcoming due dates for this module. And in just a second, I'm going to switch over to Canvas and show you where these are located. Now, you will recall in our specification ratings module and in the syllabus that you can do a certain number of engagement activities and also learning assessments to earn credit. And what we're doing is we're looking at complete or incomplete for these particular activities. And remember also in the syllabus, you can choose the number that you do for a specific letter grade. So this is going to give you a little bit more flexibility. So by Friday, March 22nd, ideally by 11:59 p.m., if you choose to do introductions, the syllabus quiz, the identify and scope discussion, those are all engagement activities. If you also choose to do the TED Talk summary, which we're going to look at in just a second, that would count as a learning assessment, also due by Friday, March 22nd. If you choose to do the introduction infographic, that's also another engagement activity. It's a little bit more in depth, but that would be due by Sunday, March 24th. So now we're going to switch over and let's look a little bit more specifically at what you will be doing. So we're going to scroll down to week 1, March 18th through the 24th, and this is where these videos will be uploaded as well. You can do your introductions for an engagement activity, and this is where you would introduce yourself in one paragraph, and you could rework your paragraph into an infographic, which is the separate infographic one. But you can also just choose to introduce yourself in one paragraph, telling us what your major is, your year in school, what you plan to do after you get your degree, why you are in this class, and at least one thing that we cannot learn about you from reading your Canvas profile. So maybe just something really interesting about yourself, something that, you know, you kind of want to share with other people. We'll go back. The introduction infographic, which is a separate engagement activity, can be drawn from your introductions. That's the one that's due by March 24th. This is a little bit more in depth. If you choose to do this engagement activity, this is the first of 2 infographics that you would create. You could post it to the introductions discussion board, and it will be graded separately. If you would like to learn about what an infographic is, it's a visual representation of information that uses design to catch the reader's eye and communicate content. I'm sure that you have seen a lot of rather entertaining infographics posted perhaps on your social media platforms. We've given you some examples of what different infographics might look like. You can use PictoChart, but there's also Canva, Easel, and Mengage. I'm a little bit more comfortable with PictoCharts, so I can definitely help with that. But they do require registration, but these are actually all free for you to use. You can also make infographics using PowerPoint or other design software. We note that for this class, just use whatever is least stressful for you. If you choose to do the infographic about yourself as an engagement activity, you would save and export it as an image file, a JPEG file, or a PNG file, and you would upload it to Canvas back over here. We'll go back to the introductions. and you can post your infographic here. Again, though, this is all dependent on what you choose to do. You might choose to do just the introductions and not the infographic. Remember, it all depends upon the total number of engagement activities that you would like to do. We also have a syllabus quiz, obviously open book. You can read the syllabus along on an extra tab if you like, and that's an additional engagement activity that you can do by March 22nd. Here are the videos that we're going to have you watch for your first tutorial, how false news can spread and the scrapping of internet privacy. You can also choose to do another engagement activity with Identify and Scope. This is how you would approach research for a class project or an assignment. You get 5 bonus credits if you draw a graphic of your research process and upload it. And finally, if you choose to do our first learning assessment, you would actually go to www.ted.com and choose something called a TED Talk. These are actually very short videos about a lot of different things going on with information technology, the way people work, and the way people think. If you choose to do this for your first learning assessment, you would choose the TED Talk from www.ted.com and answer the questions listed below in a summary of your TED Talk. And we also want you to use something called the 3-2-1 method of inquiry. What are the 3 most important things you learned? What are 2 things or ideas you would like to learn more about? And what is 1 question that is not yet answered? Again, that's something you can choose to do by March 22nd if you choose to do our first learning assessment. Again, if you have any questions about what the expectations are for this module or any confusion, remember that you can contact me, you can contact Megan, and we'd be happy to help you with that. Good luck, and I hope that you enjoy this first module.